Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the coughing. It is Friday night, and there's a Mareepin chat. I really need to find a better way to hook up my headset. I just plug it in directly to the computer. Because my cable just kind of going over my keyboard doesn't help much. Of course, my microphone's on the other side. I don't hear the annoying buzzing of my speakers. Though, how am I sounding right now? I haven't really thought of a way to get rid of the tinny sound in the microphone pickup yet. I do have one of the little foam filters on top of it now. My volume is at least audible now. I have to mute my phone because I'm tired of it interrupting things. And I caught the reap. Yay, one more electronic sheep. But it is Friday night. And Friday night means fairy tales. Okay, I've got infinite, journal pages. Wonder what would happen if I tried to refund myself. That would just be hilarious, wouldn't it? Let's see. I don't know if I can okay. I'm going to reject Law and Order. So now do I have infinity plus 500? Played it anyway. But yeah, we are here for fairy tales tonight because it is a nice, chilly Friday evening, at least in the North American continent. I'm sure it is in a lot of the Western Hemisphere, but that doesn't mean it's all evening either. Eventually, I'm going to get it where my mouth actually responds properly with the microphone. But as it is Friday and it is already after 9, do I not have my background music on in here? My background music is actually muted. I wonder when that happened. I'll mute that. But anyway, let's go ahead and go over to the library. Not my library, but, the library I read from. Because we will be reading the Grey Fairy book. I will adjust where I'm sitting again because I keep moving. So, anyone here, snuggle in, get warm, get cozy. If you need a hot chocolate, it would probably be really good right now. Because we're going to read fairy tales for the next 2 hours, if not a little longer. And I will try not to cough too much. I do have the pre-roll ads turned off, but I will have to do the 3 minutes of ads every hour, so I will try to get stories as close to finished as I can before we go to an ad break. And I'm going to try to read them a little bit more slowly. If no other reason, I will do more commentary on it, because that's what I like doing on Friday Night Fairy Tales. But it also makes it easier for me to edit afterwards. So, again, I am also sorry for all the coughing. And if you hear a cat come in, it's a cat. I'd rather have cats in a library than mice. I hate to say it, but it's true. So, our first story for this evening. Janni and the Draken. There was once a man who shunned the world and lived in the wilderness. He owned nothing but a flock of sheep, whose milk and wool he sold, and so procured himself bread to eat. He also carried wooden spoons and sold them. He had a wife and a little girl, and after a long time his wife had another child. The evening it was born, the man went to the nearest village to fetch a nurse, and on the way he met a monk, who begged him for a night's lodging. This the man willingly granted, and took him home with him. There being no one far nor near to baptize the child, the man asked the monk to do him the service, and the child was given the name of Janni. In the course of time, Janni's parents died, and he and his sister were left alone in the world. Soon affairs went badly with them, so they determined to wander away to seek their fortune. In packing up, the sister found a knife which the monk had left for his godson, and this she gave to her brother. Then they went on their way, taking with them the 3 sheep which were all that remained of the flock. After wandering for 3 days, they met a man with 3 dogs, who proposed that they should exchange animals. He was taking the sheep, and they taking the dogs. The brother and sister were quite pleased with this arrangement, and after the exchange was made, they separated and went their different ways. Janni and his sister, in course of the time, came to a great castle, in which dwelt 40 Draken, who, when they heard that Janni had come, fled 40 fathoms underground. So Janni found the castle deserted, and abode there with his sister, and every day went out to hunt with the weapons the Draken had left in the castle. One day, when he was away hunting, one of the Draken came up to get provisions, not knowing that there was anyone in the castle. When he saw Janni's sister, he was terrified, but she told him not to be afraid, and by they fell in love with each other. For every time that Janni went to hunt, the sister called the Dracos up. Thus they went on making love to each other till at length, unknown to Janni, they got married. Then, when it was too late, the sister repented, and was afraid of Janni's wrath when he found it out. One day the Dracos came to her and said, "You must pretend to be ill, and when Janni asks you what ails you and what you want, you must answer, 'cherries.' And when he inquires where these are to be found, you must say, 'There is some in a garden a day's journey away from here.' Then your brother will go and will never come back, for there dwell 3 of my brothers, who will look after him." Then the sister did as the Dracos advised. The next day Janni set out to fetch the cherries, taking his 3 dogs with him. When he came to the garden where the cherries grew, he jumped off his horse, drank some water from the spring which rose there, and fell directly into a deep sleep. The Draken came around about to eat him, but the dogs flung themselves at them and tore them to pieces, and scratched a grave in the ground with their paws, and buried the Draken so that Janni might never see their dead bodies. When Janni awoke, he saw his dogs all covered with blood. He believed that they had been caught somewhere by a wild beast, and was angry because they had left none of it for him. But he plucked the cherries and took them back to his sister. When the Dracos heard that Janni had come back, he fled for fear 40 fathoms underground, and his sister ate the cherries and declared herself well again. The next day, when Janni was gone to hunt, the Dracos came out and advised his sister that she should pretend to be ill again, and when her brother asked her what she would like, she should answer quinces. And when he inquired where these were to be found, she should say, in a garden distant about 2 days' journey. Then Janni would be destroyed, for there would be 6 brothers of the Dracos, each of whom had 2 heads. The sister did as she was advised, and next day Janni set off again, taking his 3 dogs with him. When he came to the garden, he dismounted, sat down to rest a little, and fell fast asleep. First there came 3 Draken around about to eat him, and when these 3 had been worried by the dogs, there came 3 others who were worried like in the manner. Then the dogs again dug a grave and buried all the dead Draken, that their master might not have to see them. When Janni awoke and beheld the dogs all covered in blood again, like before, he thought that they had killed a wild beast, and was again angry with them for not leaving him any of the meat. But he took the quinces and brought them back to his sister, who, when she had eaten them, declared herself better. The Dracos, when he heard that Janni had come back, fled for fear 40 fathoms deeper underground. Next day, when Janni went hunting, the Dracos went to the sister and advised her that she should again pretend to be ill, and should beg for some pears, which grew in a garden 3 days' journey from the castle. From this quest, Janni would certainly never return, for there dwelt 9 brothers of the Dracos, each of whom had 3 heads. The sister did as she was told, and the next day Janni, taking his 3 dogs with him, went to get the pears. When he came to the garden, he laid himself down to rest, and soon fell asleep. Then came the first 3 Draken to eat him, and when the dogs had worried these, 6 others came and fought the dogs a long time. The noise of this combat woke Janni, and he slew the Draken, and knew at last why the dogs were covered in blood. After that he freed all whom the Draken held prisoner, amongst others a king's daughter. Out of gratitude she would have taken him for her husband, but he put her off, saying, "For the kindness that I have been able to do to you, you shall receive in this castle all the blind and lame who pass away." The princess promised him to do so, and on his departure gave him a ring. So Janni plucked the pears and took them to his sister, who, when she had eaten them, declared that she felt better. When, however, the Dracos heard that Janni had come back yet a 3rd time, safe and sound, he fled for fright 40 fathoms deeper underground, and the next day when Janni was away hunting, he crept out and said to the sister, "Now we are indeed both lost, unless you find out from him wherein his strength lies. Then between us we will contrive to do away with him." When, therefore, Janni came back from hunting and sat at evening with his sister by the fire, she begged him to tell her wherein lay his strength. And he answered, "It lies in my 2 fingers. If these 2 are bound together, then all my strength disappears." "That I will not believe," said the sister, "unless I see it for myself." Then he let her tie his fingers together with a thread, and immediately he became powerless. Then the sister called up the Dracos, who, when he had come forth, tore out Janni's eyes and gave them to his dogs to eat, and threw him into a dry well. Now it happened that some travelers going to draw water from this well heard Janni groaning at the bottom. They came near and asked him where he was, and he begged them to draw him up from the well, for he was a poor, unfortunate man. The travelers let a rope down and drew him up to daylight. It was not till then that he first became aware that he was blind, and he begged the travelers to lead him to the country of the king whose daughter he had freed, and they would be well repaid for their trouble. When they had brought him there, he sent to beg the princess to come to him, but she did not recognize him till he had shown her the ring she had given him. Then she remembered him, and took him with her into the castle. When she learnt what had befallen him, she called together all the sorceresses in the country in order that they should tell her where the eyes were. At last she found one who declared that she knew where they were, and that she could restore them. This sorceress went straight to the castle where dwelt the sister and the Dracos, and gave something to the dogs to eat, which caused the eyes to reappear. She took them with her and put them back in Janni's head, so that he saw as well as before. Then he returned to the castle of the Dracos, whom he slew, as well as his sister, and taking his dogs with him, he went back to the princess, and they were immediately married. Okay, I'm not even going to try to guess some more on the story, because I don't know if there was one. Sisters should not fall in love with Dracos? I don't know. And it's not dragons, it's Dracos, which are more kind of like humanoid demons. They might be dragonborn, essentially, because they do have some dragon features like horns, tail, that kind of thing, but they're still fairly humanoid. There was one version of the story that actually said they were dragons, but not quite. Anyway, carrying on with our wonderful fairy tales, so slightly, hopefully, less sibling side. The partnership of the thief and the liar. There was once upon a time a thief who, being out of a job, was wandering by himself down by the seashore. As he walked, he passed a man who was standing still, looking at the waves. "I wonder," said the thief, addressing the stranger, "if you have ever seen a stone swimming." "I most certainly have," replied the other man, "and what is more, I saw the same stone jump out of the water and fly through the air." "This is capital," replied the thief. "You and I must go into a partnership. We shall certainly make our fortunes. Let us start together for the palace of the king of the neighboring country. When we get there, I will go into the presence alone, and will tell him the most startling thing I can invent. Then you must come along and follow my lie." Having agreed to this, they set out on their travels. After several days' journeying, they reached the town where the king's palace was, and here they parted for a few hours, while the thief sought an interview with the king, and begged his majesty to give him a glass of beer. "That is impossible," said the king, "as this year there have been a failure of the crops, and all the hops and the vines. We have neither wine nor beer in the whole kingdom." "That would suck." "How extraordinary," answered the thief. "I have just come from a country where the crops were so fine that I saw 12 barrels of beer made out of one branch of hops." "I bet you 300 florins that is not true," answered the king. "And I bet you 300 florins it is true," replied the thief. Then each staked his 300 florins, and the king said he would decide the question by sending a servant to that country to see if it were true. So the servant set out on horseback, and on the way he met a man, and asked him whence he came from. And the man told him that he came from the self-same country which the servant was at that moment bound. "Oh, if that is the case," said the servant, "you can tell me how high the crops grow in your country, and how many barrels of beer can be brewed from one branch." "I can't tell you that," answered the man, "but I happened to be present when the hops were being gathered in, and I saw that it took 3 men with 3 axes 3 days to cut down one branch." Then the servant thought that he might save himself a long journey, so he gave the man 10 florins and told him he must repeat to the king what he had just told him. And when they got back to the palace, they came together in the king's presence. And the king asked him, "Well, is it true about the hops?" "Yes, sire, it is," answered the servant, "and here's a man I have brought with me from the country to confirm the tale." So the king paid the thief the 300 florins, and the partners once more set out together in search of adventures. As they journeyed, the thief said to his comrade, "I will now go to another king and tell him something still more startling, and you must follow and back up my lie, and we shall get some money out of him. Just see if we don't." When they reached the next kingdom, the thief presented himself to the king and requested him to give him a cauliflower. And the king answered, "Owing to a blight among the vegetables, we have no cauliflower." "That is strange," answered the thief. "I have just come from a country where it grows as well as 1 head of cauliflower filled 12 water tubs." "I don't believe it," answered the king. "Well, I bet you 600 florins it's true," replied the thief. "And I bet you 600 florins it is not true," answered the king. And he sent for a servant and ordered him to start at once for the country whence the thief had come, to find out if his story of the cauliflower was true. On his journey the servant met with a man, and stopping his horse he asked him where he came from, and the man replied that he came from the country to which the other was traveling. "Well, if that is the case," said the servant, "you can tell me what size cauliflower grows in your country. Is it so large that 1 head fills 12 water tubs?" "I have not seen it," answered the man, "but I saw 12 wagons drawn by 12 horses carrying 1 head of cauliflower to market." And the servant answered, "Here, 10 florins, my man. You must have saved me a long journey. Now come with me and tell the king what you have just told me." "All right," said the man. And they went together to the palace, and when the king asked the servant if he had found out the truth about the cauliflower, the servant answered, "Sire, all you have heard is perfectly true. Here's a man from the country who will tell you just so." So the king asked, and he was told, and the king paid the thief the 600 florins. and the two partners set out once more on their travels, with their 900 florins. When they reached the country of the neighboring king, the thief entered the royal presence and began conversation by asking if his majesty knew that in an adjacent kingdom there was a town with a church steeple on which a bird had alighted, and that the steeple was so high and the bird's beak so long that it had pecked the stars out till they fell out of the sky. "I don't believe it," said the king. "Nevertheless, I am prepared to bet 1,200 florin that it is true," answered the thief. "And I bet 1,200 florins that it is a lie," replied the king, and he straightway sent a servant into the neighboring country to find out the truth. As he rode, the servant met a man coming in the opposite direction, so he hailed him and asked him where he came from. And the man replied that he came from the very town to which the man was bound. Then the servant asked him if the story they had heard about the bird with the long beak was true. "Oh, I don't know about that," answered the man, "as I have never seen the bird, but I once saw 12 men shoving all their might and main with brooms to push a monster egg into the cellar." "That is capital," replied the servant, presenting the man with 10 florins. "Come and tell your tale to the king, and you will save me a long journey." So, when the story was repeated to the king, there was nothing for him to do but pay the thief the 1,200 florins. Then the two partners set out again with their ill-gotten gains, and when they proceeded to divide them into equal shares, the thief kept back 3 of the florins that belonged to the liar's half of the booty. Shortly afterwards, they each married and settled down in homes of their own, with their wives. One day the liar discovered that he had been done out of 3 florins by his partner, and he went to his house and demanded them from him. "Come next Sunday, and I will give them to you," answered the thief. But he had no intention of giving the liar the money. When Saturday morning came, he stretched himself out stiff and stark upon the bed, and told his wife to say that he was dead. So the wife rubbed her eyes with an onion, and when the liar appeared at the door, she met him in tears and told him that her husband was dead, and he could not be paid the 3 florins. But the liar, who knew his partner's tricks, instantly suspected the truth and said, "And as he has not paid me, I will pay him out 3 good lashes of my riding whip." At these words the thief sprang to his feet, and appearing at the door, promised his partner that if he would return the following Saturday, he would pay him. So the liar was satisfied with the promise. But when Saturday morning came, the thief got up early and hid himself under a truss of hay in the hayloft. When the liar appeared to demand the 3 florins, the wife met him with tears in her eyes and told him that her husband was dead. "Where have you buried him?" asked the liar. "In the hayloft," answered the wife. "Then I will go there and take some hay in payment of his debt," said the liar. And proceeding to the hayloft, he began to toss about the hay with a pitching fork, protruding it into the trusses of hay till, in horror of his life, the thief crept out and promised his partner to pay him the 3 florins on the following Saturday. When the day came, he got up at sunrise, and coming down into a crypt of the neighboring chapel, stretched himself out quite still and stiff on an old stone coffin. But the liar, who was quite as clever as his partner, very soon bethought him of the crypt and set out for the chapel, confident that he would shortly discover the hiding place of his friend. He had just entered the crypt, and his eyes were not yet accustomed to the darkness, when he heard the sound of whispering on the grated windows. Listening intently, he overheard the plotting of a band of robbers who had brought their treasure to the crypt, meaning to hide it there, while they had set out fresh adventures. All the time they were speaking, they were removing the bars from the windows, and in another minute they would have all entered the crypt and discovered the liar. Quick as thought, he wound the mantle around him and placed himself standing stiff and erect in a niche of the wall, so that the dim lights he looked just like an old stone statue. As soon as the robbers entered the crypt, they set about the work dividing their treasure. Now there were 12 robbers, but the mistake of the chief of the band divided the gold into 13 heaps. When he saw his mistake, he said that they had not come in time to count over it all, but saw that the 13th heap should belong to whoever among them could strike off the head of an old stone statue in the niche with one stroke. With these words, he took up an axe, and approaching the niche where the liar was standing, but just as he waved the axe over his head ready to strike, a voice was heard from the stone coffin saying in sacral tones, "Clear out of this, or the dead will arise from their coffins, and the statues will descend from the walls. You will be driven out more dead than alive." And with a bound, the thief jumped out of his coffin, and the liar from his niche, and the robbers were so terrified that they ran helter-skelter out of the crypt, leaving all of their gold behind them, and vowing that they would never put another foot inside the haunted place again. So the partners divided the gold between them and carried it to their homes. And history tells us no more about them. That was actually an interesting one. Yeah, sorry. Let's continue, because these are some pretty interesting stories for tonight. Sorry for snarking. Our next wonderful story for this Friday night of fairy tales: Fortunatus and his Purse. Once upon a time there lived in the city of Famagusta, on the island of Cyprus, a rich man called Theodorus. He ought to have been the happiest person in the whole world, as he had all he could wish for, a wife, a little son whom he loved dearly. But unfortunately, after a short time, he always grew tired of everything and had to seek new pleasures. When people are made like this, the end is generally the same, and before Fortunatus, for that was his son's name, was 10 years old, his father had spent all his money and had not a farthing left. But though Theodorus had been so foolish, he was not quite without sense, and set about getting work at once. His wife, too, instead of reproaching him, sent away the servants and sold their fine horses, and did all the work of the house herself, even the washing of the clothes of her husband and child. Thus time passed till Fortunato was 16. One day, when he was sitting at supper, the boy said to Theodorus, "Father, why do you look so sad? Tell me what is wrong, and perhaps I can help you." My son, I have reason enough to be sad, but for me you would now have been enjoying every kind of pleasure instead of being buried in this tiny house." "Oh, do not let that trouble you," replied Fortunatus. "It is time I made some money for myself. To be sure, I have never been taught any trade. Still, there must be something I can do. I will go and walk on the seashore and think about it." Very soon, sooner than expected, a chance came, and Fortunatus, like a wise boy, seized on it at once. The post offered him that was of a page of the Earl of Flanders, and that the Earl's daughter was just going to be married. Splendid festivities were to be held in her honor, and at some of the tilting matches Fortunatus was lucky enough to win prizes. These prizes, together with presents from the lords and ladies of the court, who liked this pleasant ways, made Fortunatus feel like quite a rich man. But though his head was not turned by the notice taken of him, it excited the envy of some of the other pages about the court, and one of them, called Robert, invented a plot to remove Fortunatus out of his way. So he told the young man that the Earl had taken a disliking to him and meant to kill him. Fortunatus believed the story, and packing up his fine clothing and money, slipped away before dawn. He went to a great many big towns and lived well, and he was generous and not wise of the most youths of his age. He was very soon finding himself penniless. Like his father, he began to think of work, and tramped half over Brittany in search of it. Nobody seemed to want him, and he wandered about from one place to another, till he found himself in a dense wood, without any paths, and not much light either. He spent 2 whole days, with nothing to eat and very little water to drink, going first in one direction and then in another, but never being able to find his way out. During the first night he slept soundly, and was too tired to fear either man nor beast, but when darkness came on the second time, and growls were heard in the distance, he grew frightened and looked about for a high tree out of reach of his enemies. Hardly had he settled himself comfortably in one of the forked branches, when a lion walked up and sprang into When a lion walked up to a spring that burst from a rock close to the tree, and crouching down, drank greedily. This was bad enough, but after all, lions do not climb trees. Lie. And as long as Fortunatus stayed up on his perch, he was quite safe. But no sooner was a lion out of sight than his place was taken by a bear, and bears, as Fortunatus knew, were very good tree climbers. His heart beat fast, not without reason, for as the bear turned away he looked up, and saw Fortunatus. Now, in those days every young man carried a sword slung to his belt, and it was a fashion that came out very handily for Fortunatus. He drew his sword, and when the bear got within a yard of him, he made a fierce lunge forward. The bear, wild with pain, tried to spring, but the bough he was standing on broke with his weight, and he fell heavily to the ground. When Fortunatus descended from the tree, first taking care that there were no other wild animals around in sight, and killed him with a single blow, he was just thinking he would light a fire and make a hearty dinner off of bear's flesh, which is not at all bad eating, when he beheld a beautiful lady standing by his side, leaning on a wheel, and her eyes widened as by a bandage. Her eyes were hidden by a bandage. "I am Dame Fortune," she said, "and I have a gift for you. Shall it be wisdom, strength, long life, riches, health, or beauty? Think well, and tell me what you will have." But Fortunatus, who had proved the truth of the proverb that it's ill thinking on an empty stomach, answered quickly, "Good lady, let me have riches in such plenty that I may never again be as hungry as I am now." And the lady held out a purse and told him he only had to put in his hand into it, and he and his children would always find 10 pieces of gold. But when they were dead, it would be a magic purse no longer. At this news, Fortunatus was beside himself with joy, and could hardly find words to thank the lady. But she told him the best thing he could do was to find his way out of the wood, and before bidding him farewell, pointed out which path he should take. He walked along it as fast as his weakness would allow, until a little welcome light in the little distance showed him that a house was near. It turned out to be an inn, but before entering, Fortunatus thought he had better make sure of the truth of what the lady had told him, and took out the purse and looked inside. Sure enough, there were 10 pieces of gold shining brightly. When Fortunatus walked boldly up to the inn and ordered them to get a good supper ready at once, as he was very hungry, and to bring him the best wine in the house. And he seemed to care so little what he spent that everybody thought he was a great lord, and vied with each other who should run quickest when he called. After a night passed in a soft bed, Fortunatus felt so much better that he asked the landlord if he could find him some men-servants and tell him where any good horses were to be gotten. The next thing was to provide himself with some smart clothes, and then take a big house where he could give great feasts to the nobles and beautiful ladies who lived in palaces around the area. In this manner, a whole year soon slipped away, and Fortunatus was so busy amusing himself that he never once remembered his parents, whom he had left behind in Cyprus. But though he was thoughtless, he was not bad-hearted. As soon as their existence crossed his mind, he set about making preparations to go and visit them, and as he was not fond of being alone, he looked around for some older and wiser than himself to travel with. It was not long before he had the good luck to come across an old man who had left his wife and children in a far country many years before, when he went out in the world to seek a fortune which he never found. He agreed to accompany Fortunatus back to Cyprus, but only on the condition he should be first allowed to return in a few weeks to his own home before venturing to set sail for an island so strange and distant. Fortunatus agreed to the proposal, and as he was always fond of anything new, said that he would like to go with him. The journey was long, and they had to cross many large rivers and climb over high mountains and find their way through thick woods before they reached at length the old man's castle. His wife and children had almost given up hopes of seeing him again, and crowded eagerly around him. Indeed, it did not take Fortunatus 5 minutes to fall in love with the youngest daughter, the most beautiful creature in the whole world, whose name was Cassandra. "Give her to me for my wife," he said to the old man, "and let us go all together to Famagosta." So a ship was bought, big enough to hold Fortunatus, the man, his wife, and their 10 children, 5 of them sons and 5 of them daughters. And the day before they sailed, the wedding was celebrated with magnificent rejoicings, and everybody thought Fortunatus must certainly be a prince in disguise. But when they reached Cyprus, he learned to his sorrow that both his father and mother were dead, and for some time he shut himself up in his house, and would see nobody, full of shame at having forgotten them all these years. Then he begged the old man and his wife to remain with him and take the place of his parents. For 12 years, Fortunatus and Cassandra and their 2 little boys lived happily in Famagosta. They had a beautiful house and everything they could possibly want, and when Cassandra's sisters married, the purse provided them each with a fortune. But at last Fortunatus grew tired of staying at home, and thought he would like to go out and see the world again. Cassandra shed many tears at first when he told her of his wishes, and he had a great deal of trouble to persuade her to give her consent. But on his promising to return at the end of 2 years, she agreed to let him go. But before he went away, he stowed her 3 chests of gold, which stood in a room with an iron door, and walls 12 feet thick. "If anything should happen to me," he said, "and I should never come back, keep one of the chests for yourself, and give the others to our sons." Then he embraced them all, and took a ship for Alexandria. The wind was fair, and in a few days they entered the harbor, where Fortunatus was informed by a man whom he met on the landing that, if he wished to be well received in town, he must begin by making a handsome present to the Sultan. "That is easily done," said Fortunatus, and he went to a goldsmith's shop where he bought a large gold cup, which cost 5,000 pounds. This gift so pleased the Sultan that he ordered 100 casks of spices to be given to Fortunatus. Fortunatus put them on board his ship and commanded his captain to return to Cyprus and deliver them to his wife Cassandra. He next obtained an audience with the Sultan, and begged permission to travel through the country, which the Sultan readily gave him, adding some letters to the rulers of other lands which Fortunatus might wish to visit. Filled with delight at feeling himself free to roam through the world once more, Fortunatus set out on his journey without losing a day. From court to court he went, astonishing everyone by the magnificence of his dress and the splendor of his presence. At length he grew as tired of wandering as he had been of staying home, and returned to Alexandria, where he found the same ship that had brought him from Cyprus lying in the harbor. Of course, the first thing he did was pay his respects to the Sultan, who was eager to hear about his adventures. When Fortunatus had told them all, the Sultan observed, "Oh, you have seen many wonderful things, but I have something to show you more wonderful still." And he led him into a room where precious stones lay heaped against the walls. Fortunatus's eyes were quite dazzled, but when the Sultan went on without pausing and opened a door at the farther end, as far as Fortunatus could see, the cupboard was quite bare, except for a little red cap, such as the soldiers wear in Turkey. "Look at this," said the Sultan. "But there's nothing very valuable about it," answered Fortunatus. "I've seen a dozen better caps than that this very day." "Ah," said the Sultan, "you do not know what you are talking about. Whoever puts this cap on his head and wishes himself in any place, he will find himself there in a moment." "Who made it?" asked Fortunatus. "I cannot tell you," replied the Sultan. "Is it very heavy to wear?" asked Fortunatus. "No, quite light," replied the Sultan. "Just feel it." Fortunatus took the cap and put it on his head, and then, without thinking, wished himself back to the ship that was starting for Famagosta. In a second he was standing on the prow, while the anchor was being weighed, and while the Sultan was repenting his folly in allowing Fortunatus to try on the cap, the vessel was making fast for Cyprus. When it arrived, Fortunatus took the cap and put it... No. When it arrived, Fortunatus found his wife and children well, but the two old people had been dead and buried. His sons had grown tall and strong, but, unlike their father, had no wish to see the world, and found their chief pleasure in hunting and tilting. In the main, Fortunatus was content to stay quietly at home, as if his restless fits did seize upon him, he was able to go away for a few hours without being missed, thanks to the cap, which he never sent back to the Sultan. By and by he grew old, and feeling that he had not many days left to live, he sent for his two sons, showing them the purse and cap. He said to them, "Never part with these precious possessions. They are worth more than all the gold and lands I leave behind me. But never tell their secret, even to your wife or dearest friend. The purse has served me well for 40 years, and no one knows whence I got the riches." Then he died, and was buried by his wife Cassandra, and he was mourned in Famagosta for many years. Okay, how long is this next one? Hey, guilty. Yes, a stretch and a hydrator, definitely do. Ouch. Let's see, I've got a little over 9 minutes before our ads are going to run again. I'm not sure if I could do the next story before then. I can try it, though. because the next story would be the goat-faced girl. There were once upon a time a peasant called Mansanio who had 12 daughters. They were exactly like the steps of a staircase, for there was just a year between each sister. It was all the poor man could do to bring up such a large family, and in order to provide food for them, he used to dig in the fields all day long. In spite of his hard work, he only just succeeded in keeping the wolf from the door, and the poor little girls often went hungry to bed. One day, Masaneo was working at the foot of the high mountain when he came upon the mouth of a cave, which was so dark and gloomy that even the sun failed to enter it. Suddenly a huge green lizard appeared from inside and stood before Masaneo, who nearly went out of his mind with terror, for the beast was as big as a crocodile, and quite as fierce-looking. But the lizard sat down beside him in the most friendly manner and said, "Don't be afraid of me, my man. I'm not going to hurt you. On the contrary, I'm most anxious to help you." When the peasant heard these words, he knelt before the lizard and said, "Dear lady, for I know not what to call you, I am in your power, but I beg of you to be merciful, for I have 12 wretched little daughters at home who are dependent on me." "That's the very matter I've come to you," replied the lizard. "Bring me your youngest daughter tomorrow morning. I promise to bring her up as if she were my own child, and to look upon her as the apple of my eye." When Mansaneo heard her words, he was very unhappy, because he felt sure that, from the lizard's wanting one of his daughters, the youngest and tenderest too, that the poor girl would only serve as a dessert for the terrible creature's supper. At the same time, he said to himself, "If I refuse her request, she will certainly eat me up on the spot. If I give her what she asked, does she indeed take part of myself? But if I refuse, she will take the whole of me. What am I to do, and how in the world am I to get out of this difficulty?" As he kept muttering to himself, the lizard said, "Make up your mind and do as I tell you at once. I desire to have your youngest daughter, and if you don't comply with my wish, I can only say it will be worse for you." Seeing that there was nothing else to be done, Mansaneo set off to home, and arrived there looking so white and wretched that his wife asked him at once, "What happened to you, my dear husband? Have you quarreled with someone, or has the poor donkey fallen down?" "Neither the one nor the other," answered the husband, "but something far worse than either. A terrible lizard has nearly frightened me out of my senses, for she threatened that if I do not give her our youngest daughter, she would make me repent it. My head is going round like a wheel-mill. I don't know what to do, and I am indeed between the devil and the deep sea. You know how dearly I love Renzola, and yet if I fail to bring her to the lizard tomorrow morning, I must say farewell to life. Do advise me what to do." When his wife had heard all he had to say, she said to him, "How do you know, my dear husband, that the lizard is really our enemy? She might not be a friend in disguise, and your meeting with her may be the beginning of a better things at the end of all our misery. Therefore go and take the child to her, for my heart tells me that you'll never repent doing so." Mansanello was much comforted by her words, and the next morning, as soon as it was light, he took his little daughter by the hand and led her to the cave. The lizard, who was waiting for the peasant's arrival, came forward to meet him, and taking the girl by the hand, she gave her father a sack full of gold, and said, "Go and marry your other daughters, and give them dowries with this gold, and be of good cheer. For Renzola will have both father and mother in me. It is a great piece of luck for her that she has fallen into my hands." Massanio, quite overcome with gratitude, thanked the lizard and returned home to his wife. As soon as it was known how rich the peasants had become, suitors for the hands of his daughters were not wanting, and very soon he married them all off, and even then there was enough gold to keep himself and his wife in comfort for the rest of their days. As soon as the lizard was left alone with Renzolla, she changed the cave into a beautiful palace, and led the girl inside. Here she brought her up like a little princess, and the child wanted for nothing. She gave her sumptuous food to eat and beautiful clothes to wear, and 1,000 servants to wait upon her. Now, it happened one day that the king of the country was hunting in a wood close to the palace, and was overtaken by the dark. Seeing a light shining in the palace, he sent one of his servants to ask if he could get a night's lodging there. When the page knocked at the door, the lizard changed herself into a beautiful woman and opened the door. When she heard the king's request, she sent him a message to say that she would be delighted to see him, and give him all he wanted. The king, on hearing this kind invitation, instantly betook himself to the palace, where he was received in a most hospitable manner. 100 pages with torches came out to meet him, and 100 more waited on him at the table. Another 100 waved big fans in the air to keep the flies off of him. Renzolla herself poured out the wine for him, and so gracefully did she do it that his majesty could not take his eyes off of her. When the meal was finished and the table cleared, the king retired to sleep, and Renzolla drew the shoes from his feet, and at the same time drawing his heart from his breast. So desperately had he fallen in love with her that he called the fairy to him, and asked her for Renzolla's hand in marriage. As the kind fairy had only the girl's welfare at heart, she willingly gave her consent, and not her consent only, but a wedding portion of 7,000 gold guineas. The king, full as delight as over the good fortune, prepared to take the departure, and accompanied by Renzolla, who never so much thanked the fairy for all she had done for her, when the fairy saw such base want of gratitude, she determined to punish the girl, and cursing her, she turned her face into a goat's head. In a moment Renzolla's pretty mouth stretched into a snout, with a beard a yard long at the end of it. Her cheeks sank in, and her shining plaits of hair changed into 2 sharp horns. When the king turned around and saw her, he thought he must have taken leave of his senses. He burst into tears and cried out, "Where is the hair that bound me so tightly? Where are the eyes that pierced through my heart? Where are the lips that I kissed? Am I to be tied to this goat all my life? No, no, nothing will induce me to become the laughing-stock of my subjects for the sake of a goat-faced girl." When they reached his own country, he shut Renzolla up in a little turret chamber of his palace, with the waiting maid, and gave each of them 10 bundles of flax to spin, telling them that their task must be finished by the end of the week. The maid, obedient to the king's commands, set at once at work and combed out the flax, wound it around the spindle, and sat spinning her wheel so diligently that her work was quite done by Saturday evening. The lips that he kissed. But Renzolla, who had been spoilt and petted in a fairy's house, was quite unaware of the change that had taken place in her appearance, threw the flax out the window and said, "What is a king thinking about me should give me all this work to do? If he wants shirts, he can buy them. It isn't easy when he had picked me out of the gutter. He ought to remember that I brought him 7,000 gold guineas as a wedding portion, and that I am his wife and not his slave. He must be mad to treat me like this." At the same, when Saturday evening came and she saw that the waiting maid had finished her task, she took fright lest she should be punished for her idleness. So she hurried off the palace of the fairy, and confided in her all her woes. The fairy embraced her tenderly, and gave her a sack full of spun flax in order that she might show it to the king, and let him see what a good worker she was. Renzolla took the sack without one word of thanks, and returned to the palace, leaving the kind fairy very indignant over her want of gratitude. When the king saw all the flax was spun, he gave Renzolla and the waiting maid each a little dog, and told them to look after the animals, and to train them carefully. The waiting maid brought hers up with the greatest possible care, and treated it almost as if it was her own son. But Renzolla said, "I don't know what to think. Have I come along with lunatics? Does the king imagine that I'm going to comb and feed my dog with my own hands?" With these words, she opened the window and threw the little dog out, and it fell down to the ground as dead as a stone. I do not like this princess. When a few months had passed, the king sent a message to say he would like to see how the dogs were getting on. Renzolla, who felt very uncomfortable in her mind at the request, hurried off at once more to the ferry. This time she found an old man at the door of the fairy's palace, who said to her, "Who are you, and what do you want?" When Renzolla heard his question, she answered angrily, "Don't you know me, old goatbeard? How dare you address me in such a way?" "Pot can't call the kettle black," answered the old man, "for it is not I, but you who have a goat's head. Just wait a moment, you ungrateful wretch, and I will show you what a pass you want for gratitude has brought you." With these words he hurried away, and returned with a mirror, which he held up before Renzolla. At the sight of her ugly, hairy face, the girl nearly fainted with horror, and she broke out into loud sobs at seeing her countenance so changed. Then the old man said, "You must remember, Renzolla, that you are the peasant's daughter, and the fairy turned you into a queen. But you were ungrateful, and never as much thanked her for all she had done for you. Therefore she is determined to punish you, and if you lose your long white beard, throw yourself at the fairy's feet and implore her to forgive you. She has a tender heart and will, perhaps, take pity on you." Renzolla, who was really sorry for her conduct, took the old man's advice, and the fairy not only gave her back her former face, but she dressed her in a gold-embroidered dress, presented her with a beautiful carriage, and brought her back, accompanied by a host of servants, to her husband. When the king saw her looking as beautiful as ever, he fell in love with her once more, and bitterly repented having caused her so much suffering. So Renzolla lived happily ever after, for she loved her husband, honored the fairy, and gave the old man for having told her the truth. Ouch. Hey, Ryder. How did the game go? Hold on. Helps if I can type. Ooh. So much smoke? That's not good. So did the flue get shut somehow, or did it just all blow back in? Ugh. Let's see, wind gust. That means it's going to get colder again, probably. We don't need smoked snake. Not that it isn't tasty by any means, but no, we don't need smoked snake. Oh, a little bit colder isn't bad. I don't know. Is the oven big enough, Squall? So if a snake learns lizard, does that make you bilingual? It looks like the ads are about to start. So, ads are about to kick in. I can get up and stretch real quick. Oh, this chair hurts after a while. I'll come back over to this one. Let's see. The ads still have another 20 seconds or so. Gone through a lot of stories so far tonight. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 4 stories so far. Not bad. Okay, why isn't the scene changing? Or is it just that far delayed? There we go. Oh well. We've done 4 stories so far tonight. We did Janni and the Draken, the partnership of the thief and the liar, Fortunatus and his purse, and we just finished the goat-faced girl. So I think we can probably do at least 3 more. And I haven't been attacked by my cats yet wanting attention, so I guess we're doing good. Okay, I'm not muted. Have to make sure of everything. Okay, let's get back to the library. Hydrate again. Nope, cat's here. Hey, cat. Okay. Oh, well, this is going to be an interesting one. Yes, more fire! Wow, even warm enough to take off the scarf. Of course, I had to put on a bathrobe to keep myself from being scratched from cats, but still. Oh, I just got a notification saying temps are going to plummet tomorrow. Yay. Let's see what it says. Let's see, we're in the 50s today, back down to the 30s tomorrow. Lovely. Get over there. Yes, little cat, I will pet you. I will pet the little cat. Phoenix might be good for this time of year. Okay, let's see. What story? Yeah, we need to get you some sound alerts on your stream. If nothing else, so I can warn you about ads popping up. Let's see. Make sure I'm not. Okay. Between pages. This book is illustrated. Too bad I can't show you the pictures. It looks like this next one is about abduction when picking flowers. Sounds fun. And I haven't had a single singing story this time. I'm doing good. I wonder how long that'll last. Anyway, if you need to relax, get warm, drink some hot chocolate or something, feel free to. And we're gonna get into some more stories. Because our next story for this fabulous Friday night of fairy tales: What Came of Picking Flowers. There was once a woman who had 3 daughters whom she loved very much. One day the eldest was walking in a water meadow when she saw pink glowing in the stream. She stooped to pick the flower, but her hand had scarcely touched it when she vanished altogether. The next morning the second sister went out into the meadow to see if she could find any traces of the lost girl, and as a branch of lovely roses lay trailing across her path, she bent down to move it away, and in doing so couldn't resist plucking one of the roses. In a moment she too had disappeared. Wondering what could have become of her 2 sisters, the youngest followed in their footsteps, and fell victim to a branch of delicious white jessamine. So the old woman was left without any daughters at all. She wept and wept and wept all day and all night, and went on weeping so long that her son, who had been a little boy when his sisters disappeared, grew up to be a tall youth. Then one night he asked his mother to tell him what was the matter. When he heard the whole story, he said, "Give me your blessing, mother, and I will go and search the world till I find them." So he set forth, and after he traveled several miles without any adventures, he came upon 3 big boys fighting in the road. He stopped and inquired what they were fighting about, and one of them answered, "My lord, our dear father has left us when he died a pair of boots, a key, and a cap. Whoever puts on the boots and wishes himself in a place will find himself there. The key will open every door in the world, and the cap on your head, and no one can see you. Now our dear eldest brother wants to have all three things for himself, and we wish to draw lots for them." "Oh, that is easily settled," said the youth. "I will throw a stone as far as I can, and the one who picks it up first shall have all three." So he took a stone and flung it, and while all three brothers were running after it, he hastily drew on the boots and said, "Boots, take me to the place where I shall find my eldest sister." The next morning the young man was standing on a steep mountain before the gates of a strong castle, guarded by bolts and bars and iron chains. The key, which he had not forgotten to put in his pocket, opened the doors one by one, and he walked through a number of halls and corridors till he met a beautiful and richly dressed young lady who started back in surprise at the sight of him, and exclaimed, "Oh, sir, how did you contrive to get in here?" The young man replied that he was her brother, and told her by what means he was able to pass through the doors. In return, she told him how happy she was, except for one thing, and that was her husband lay under a spell, and could never break it till there should be put to death a man who could not die. They talked together for a long time, and then the lady said that he had better leave her, as she expected her husband back at any moment, and he might not like him to be there. The young man assured her she need not be afraid, as he had with him a cap that would make him invisible. They were still deep in conversation when the door suddenly opened, and a bird flew in. But he saw nothing unusual, for at the noise the youth put on his cap. The lady jumped up and brought a large golden basin into which the bird flew, reappearing directly after as a handsome man. Turning to his wife, he cried, "I'm sure someone is in the room." She got frightened and declared that she was quite alone, but her husband persisted, and in the end she had to confess the truth. "But if he is really your brother, why did you hide him?" he asked. "I believe you are telling me a lie, and if he comes back I shall kill him." At this the youth took off his cap and came forward. Then the husband saw that he indeed was so like his wife that he doubted her word no longer, and embraced his new brother-in-law with delight. Drawing a feather from his bird's skin, he said, "If you are in danger, cry, 'Come help me, king of birds.' Everything will go well for you." The young man thanked him and went away, and after he left the castle, he told the boots that they must take him to the place where his second sister was living. As before, he found himself at the gates of a huge castle, and within was his second sister, very happy with her husband, who loved her deeply, but longing for the moment when he should be set free from the spell that kept him half his life of fish. When he arrived and had been introduced by his wife to her brother, he welcomed him warmly and gave him a fish scale, saying that, "If you are ever in danger, call for me. Come and help me, king of the fishes, and everything will go well with you." The young man thanked him and took his leave, and when he was outside the gates he told the boots to take him to the place where his youngest sister lived. The boots carried him to a dark cavern with steps of iron leading up into it. Inside she sat, weeping and sobbing, as she had done nothing else the whole time she had been there. The poor girl was very thin. When she saw a man standing before her, she sprang to her feet and exclaimed, "Oh, whisper whoever you are! Save me and take me from this horrible place!" Then he told her who he was, and how he had seen her sisters, whose happiness was spoilt by the spell under which both their husbands lay, and she, in turn, related her story. She had been carried off in the water meadow by a horrible monster who wanted to make her marry him by force, and had kept her a prisoner all these years because she would not submit to his will. Every day he came to beg her to consent to his wishes, and to remind her that there was no hope of her being set free, as he was the most constant man in the world. Besides that, he could never die. At these words the youth remembered his two enchanted brother-in-laws, and advised his sister to promise to marry the old man, if he would tell her why he could never die. Suddenly, everything began to tremble as if it was shaken by a whirlwind, and an old man entered, flinging himself at the feet of the girl, and he said, "Are you still determined never to marry me? If so, you will have to sit there weeping till the end of the world, for I shall always be faithful to my wish to marry you." "Oh, I will marry you," she said, "if you will tell me why that you can never die." The old man burst into peals of laughter. "You're thinking how you would be able to kill me. Well, to do that, you would have to find an iron casket which lies at the bottom of the sea and has a white dove inside. Then you would have to find the egg which the dove laid and bring it here and dash it against my head." And again he laughed with a certainty that no one had ever got down to the bottom of the sea, and if they did, they would never find the casket, and never be able to open it. When he could speak once more, he said, "Now you will be obliged to marry me, as you know my secret." But she begged so hard that the wedding night be put off for 3 days that he consented, and went away rejoicing at his victory. When he disappeared, the brother took off the cap which had kept him invisible all this time, and told his sister not to lose heart, as he hoped in 3 days she would be free. Then he drew on his boots and wished himself at the seashore, and there he was directly. And drawing out the fish scale, he cried, "Come and help me, king of the fishes!" And his brother-in-law swam up and asked what he could do. The young man related the story, and when he had finished, his listener summoned all the fishes into his presence. At last to arrive was a little sardine who apologized for being late, but she had hurt herself by knocking her head against an iron casket that lay at the bottom of the sea. The king ordered several of the largest and strongest of his subjects to take the little sardine as a guide, and bring him the iron casket. They soon returned with the box placed on their backs, and laid it down before him. Then the youth produced the key and said, "Key, open that box!" And the key opened it. And though they were all crowding around, ready to catch it, the white dove within flew away. It was useless to go after it, for the moment the young man's heart sank. The next minute, however, he remembered that he still had his feather, and drew it out, crying, "Come to me, king of the birds!" And a rushing noise was heard, and the king of the birds perched on his shoulder, and asked what he could do to help him. His brother-in-law told him the whole story, and when he had finished, the king of the birds commanded all his subjects to hasten to his presence. In an instant the air was dark with birds of all sizes, and the very last to come was the white dove, apologizing for being so late, saying that an old friend had arrived at his nest, and he had been obliged to give him some dinner. The king of the birds ordered some of them to show the young man the white dove's nest, and when they reached it, there lay an egg which was to break the spell and set them all free. When it was safely in his pocket, he told the boots to carry him straight to the cavern where his youngest sister sat waiting. Now, It was already far into the third day, which the old man had fixed for the wedding, and when the youth reached the cavern with his cap on his head, he found the monster there, urging the girl to keep her word and let the marriage take place at once. At a sign from her brother, she sat down and invited the old monster to lay his head on her lap. Oh, he did so with delight, and her brother, standing behind her, pressed her past her the egg unseen. She took it and dashed it straight at the horrible head, and the monster started, and with a groan that people took for rumblings of an earthquake, he turned over and died. As the breath went out of his body, the husbands of the two eldest daughters resumed their proper shapes, and sending for their mother-in-law, whose sorrow was so unexpectedly turned to joy, they had a great feast, and the youngest sister was rich to the end of her days with the treasures they had found in the cave that had been collected by the monster. So, lots of these fairy tale parents have 3 daughters. Seems to be a common thing. Don't pick flowers, you'll be abducted by random beasts. Okay. Our next wonderful fairy tale for this Friday night. One that I have read before. I can't remember which book it is in, but it was probably in the Beauty and the Beasts. But it is the story of Bensurdatu. There was once a king and a queen who had 3 wonderfully beautiful daughters, and their one thought from morning till night was how they could make the girls happy. One day the princesses said to the king, "Dear father, we want so much to have a picnic and eat our dinner in the country." "Very well, dear children, let us have a picnic by all means," answered he, and gave orders that everything should be gotten ready. When luncheon was prepared and put into a cart, the royal family stepped into the carriage and drove right away into the country. For a few miles they reached a house and a garden belonging to the king, and close by was their favorite place to lunch. The drive had made them very hungry, and they ate with a hearty appetite till almost all the food had disappeared. When they had quite done, they said to their parents, "Now we should like to wander about the garden a little. When you want to go home, just call us." And they ran off, laughing down the green glade which led to the garden. But no sooner had they stepped across the fence than a dark cloud came down and covered them, preventing them from seeing whither they were going. Meanwhile, the king and queen sat lazily among the heather, and an hour or 2 slipped away. The sun was dropping towards the horizon, and they began to think that it was time to go home. So they called to their daughters, then called again, but no one answered them. Frightened by the silence, they searched every corner of the garden, the house, and the neighboring wood, but no trace of the girls was to be found anywhere. The earth seemed to have swallowed them up. The poor parents were in despair. The queen wept all the way home and for many days after. The king issued a proclamation that whoever should bring back his lost daughters should have one of them to wife, and should, after my death, reign in my stead. Now, two young generals were at the time living at the court, and when they heard the king's declaration, they said to one another, "Let us go in search of them. Perhaps we shall be the lucky persons." And they set out, each mounted on a strong horse, taking with them a change of raiment and some money. But though they inquired at every village they rode through, they could hear nothing of the princesses, and by all their money was spent, and they were forced to sell their horses or to give up the search. Even this money only lasted a little while longer, and nothing but their clothes lay between them and starvation. They sold their spare garments that were bound on their saddles, and went in the coats they stood up in the inn, to beg for some food, as they were really starving. When, however, they had to pay for what they had eaten and drank, they said to the host, "We have no money, and naught but the clothes we stand up in. Take these, and give us instead some old rags, and let us stay here to serve you." The innkeeper was content with this bargain, and the generals remained, and were his servants. All this time the king and queen remained in the palace, hungering for their children, but not a word was heard from either of them or of the generals who had gone to seek for them. Now, there was living in the palace a faithful servant of the king's called Bensurdatu, who had served him for many years, and when Bensurdatu saw how grieved the king was, he lifted up his voice and said to him, "Your Majesty, let me go and seek your daughters." "No, no, Bensurdatu," replied the king. "3 daughters I have lost, and 2 generals, and shall I lose you also?" But Bensurdatu said again, "Let me go, your Majesty, trust me. I will bring back to you your daughters." Then the king gave way, and Bensurdatu set forth, and rode on till he came to the same inn, where he dismounted and asked for food. It was brought by the 2 generals, whom he knew at once in spite of their miserable clothing, and, much astonished, asked them how in the world they had come there. They told him all their adventures, and he sent for the innkeeper and said to him, "Give me back their garments, and I will pay for everything they owe you." And the innkeeper did as he was bid, and when the 2 generals were dressed in their proper clothes, they declared they would join Bensurdatu, and with him seek the king's daughters. The 3 companions rode on for many miles, and at length they came to a wild place without sign of human beings. It was getting dark, and fearing to be lost on this desolate spot, they pushed on their horses, and at last saw a light in the window of a tiny hut. "Who goes there?" asked a voice as they knocked at the door. "Oh, have pity on us and give us a night's shelter," replied Bensurdatu. "We are 3 tired travelers who have lost our way." Then the door was opened by a very old woman who stood back, beckoning them to enter. "Whence do you come, and whither do you go?" she said. "Ah, good woman, we have a very heavy task before us," answered Bensurdatu. "We are bound to carry the king's daughters back to the palace." "Oh, unhappy creatures!" he cried. "You know not what you are doing. The king's daughters were covered by a thick cloud, and no one knows where they may have been." "Oh, tell us if you know, my good woman," entreated Bensurdatu. "With them lies all our happiness." "Even if I were to tell you," answered she, "you could not rescue them. To do that, you would have to go to the very bottom of a deep river, and through certainly you would find the king's daughters there. Yet the 2 eldest are guarded by 2 giants, and the youngest is watched by a serpent with 7 heads." 2 generals who stood by listening were filled with terror at her words, and wished to return immediately. But Bensurdatu stood firm and said, "Now, we have gone so far we must carry the thing through. Tell us where the river is so that we may get there as soon as possible." And the old woman told them, and gave them some cheese, wine, and bread, so that they should not set forth starving. And when they had eaten and drunk, they laid themselves down to sleep. The sun had only just risen above the hills next morning, before they all woke, and taking leave of the wise woman who had helped them, they rode on till they came to the river. "I am the oldest," said one of the generals, "and it is my right to go down first." So the others fastened a cord around him, and gave him a little bell, and let him down into the water. But scarcely had the river closed above his head when such dreadful rushing sounds and peals of thunder came crashing round about him that he lost all his courage and rang his bell, if perchance it might be heard amongst all this clamour. Great was his relief when the rope began slowly to pull him upwards. Then the other general plunged in, but he fared no better than the first, and was soon on dry ground again. "Well, you are a brave pair," said Bensurdatu, as he tied the rope round his own waist. "Let us see what will happen to me." And when he heard the thunder and clamour around him, he thought to himself, "Oh, make as much noise as you like, it won't hurt me." When his feet touched the bottom, he found himself in a large, brilliantly lighted hall. In the middle sat the eldest princess, and in front of her lay a huge giant, fast asleep. Directly she saw Bensurdatu, she nodded to him, and asked with her eyes how he had come there. For answer, he drew his sword, and was about to cut off the giant's head, when she stopped him quickly, and made signs to hide himself. The giant was just beginning to wake. "I smell a fresh man," murmured he, stretching out his great arms. "Why in the world could any man get down here?" she replied. "You had better go to sleep again." So he turned over and went to sleep. Then the princess signed to Bensurdatu, who drew his sword and cut off the giant's head with such a blow that it flew into the corner. And the heart of the princess leapt within her, and she placed a golden crown on the head of Bensurdatu, and called him her deliverer. "Now, show me where your sisters are," she said, "that I may free them also." So the princess opened a door and led him into another hall, wherein sat her next sister, guarded by a giant who was also fast asleep. When the second princess saw them, she made a sign to hide themselves, for the giant was showing signs of waking. "I smell a man's flesh," murmured he sleepily. "Now, how could any man get down here?" she said. "Go to sleep again." And as he closed his eyes, Bensurdatu stole out from his corner and struck such a blow that his head flew far, far away. The princess could not find words to thank Bensurdatu for what he had done, and she too placed in his hand a golden crown. "Now, show me where your youngest sister is," he said, "that I may free her also." That I fear you will never be able to do," they sighed, "for she is in the power of the serpent with 7 heads. "Take me to him," replied Bensurdatu. "It will be a splendid fight." The princess opened the door, and Bensurdatu passed through, and found himself in the hall that was even larger than the other 2, and there stood the youngest sister, chained fast to the wall, and before her was stretched a serpent with 7 heads, horrible to see. As Bensurdatu came forward, it twisted all 7 of its heads in one direction, and made a quick dart to snatch him within its grasp. But Bensurdatu drew his sword and laid him about, till all 7 heads were rolling on the floor. Flinging down his sword, he rushed to the princess and broke her chains, and she wept for joy and embraced him. and took the golden crown from off her head and placed it in his hand. "Now we must go back to the upper world," said Bensurdatu, and led her to the bottom of the river. The other princesses were waiting there, and he tied the rope around the eldest and rung his bell, and the generals above heard and drew her up gently. Then unfastened the cord and threw it back into the river. In a few moments the second princess stood beside her. Now there left only Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. "Dear Bensurdatu," she said, "do me a kindness and let them draw you up before me. I dread the treachery of the generals." "Oh, no," replied Bensurdatu. "I certainly will not leave you down here. There's nothing to fear from my comrades." "If it is your wish, I will go up then, but I first swear that if I do not follow, marry me. I shall stay single for the rest of my life." Then he bound a rope around her, and the generals drew her up. But instead of lowering the rope again into the river, envy at the courage and success of Bensurdatu so filled the hearts of the two generals that they turned away and left him to perish. And more than that, they threatened to the princesses and forced them to promise to tell their parents that it was the two of them who had set them free. "And if they should ever ask about Bensurdatu, you must say that you never saw him," they added. And the princesses, fearing for their lives, promised everything, and they rode back to court together. The king and queen were beside themselves with joy when they saw their dear children once more. But when the generals told their story, the dangers they had run, the king declared that they had gained their reward, and that the two eldest princesses should become their wives. Now, we must see what poor Bensurdatu was doing. He waited a long, long time, but when the rope never came back, he knew that he had been wronged, and that his comrades had betrayed him. "Now I shall never reach the world again," murmured he. But being a brave man, and knowing the mourning his fate would profit him nothing, he rose and began to search through the 3 halls. There, perhaps, he might find something to help himself. In the last one stood a dish, covered with food, which reminded him that he was rather hungry, so he sat down and ate and drank. Months passed away, when one morning as he was walking through the halls, he noticed a purse hanging on the wall, which he had never been there before. He took it down to examine it, and nearly let it fall with surprise when a voice came from the purse, asking, "What commands have you?" "Oh, take me out of this horrible place and up into the world again." And in a moment, there he was, standing at the river bank, with the purse tightly grasped in his hand. "Now, let me have the most beautiful ship that was ever built, all manned and ready for sea." And there was a ship, with a flag floating on its masts, in which were the words, "King with 3 crowns." Then Bensurdatu climbed on board and sailed away to the city where the 3 princesses dwelt. And when he reached the harbor, he blew trumpets and beat drums, that everyone ran to the doors and windows. And the king too heard, and saw the beautiful vessel, and said to himself, "That must be mighty monarch, for he has 3 crowns, while I only have 1. So he hastened to greet the stranger and invite him into the castle, for, thought he, "This is a fine husband for my youngest daughter." Now the youngest princess had never married, and had turned a deaf ear to all of her wooers. Such a long time had passed since Bensurdatu had left the palace that the king never guessed for a moment that the splendidly clad stranger before him was a man whom he had so deeply mourned as dead. "Noble lord," said he, "let us feast and make merry together, and then, if it seem good to you, do me the honor to take my youngest daughter to wife." And Bensurdatu was glad, and they all sat down to a great feast where there were great rejoicings. But only the youngest daughter was sad, for her thoughts were with Bensurdatu. After they rose from the table, the king said to her, "Dear child, this mighty lord does you the honor to ask your hand in marriage."
"Oh, father," she asked, "spare me, I pray you. I desire to remain single."
Then Bensurdatu turned to her and said, "And if I were Bensurdatu, would you give the same answer to me?" And she stood silently gazing at him, and he added, "Yes, I am Bensurdatu, and this is my story." The king and queen had their hearts stirred within them while the tale of his adventures, and when he ended, the king stretched out his hand and said, "Dear Bensurdatu, my youngest daughter shall indeed be your wife, and when I die, my crown shall be yours. As for the men who betrayed you, they shall leave the country, and you shall see them no more." And the wedding feast was ordered, and rejoicings were held for 3 days for the marriage of Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. Okay. Lucky at the time. This will probably be the last story for the evening. The Magician's Horse. Once upon a time there was a king who had 3 sons. Now it happened that one day the 3 princes went out hunting in a large forest at some distance from their father's palace, and the youngest prince lost his way, so his brothers had to return home without him. For 4 days the prince wandered through the glades of the forest, sleeping on moss beneath the stars at night, and by day living on roots and wild berries. At last, on the morning of the 5th day, he came to a large open space in the middle of the forest, and here stood a stately palace, but neither within nor without was there any trace of human life. The prince entered the open door and wandered through the deserted rooms without seeing a living soul. At last he came on a great hall, and in the center of the hall was a table spread with dainty dishes and choice wines. The prince sat down and satisfied his hunger and thirst, and immediately afterwards the table disappeared from his sight. This struck the prince as strange, but though he continued his search through all the rooms, upstairs and down, he could find no one to speak to. At last, just as it was beginning to get dark, he heard steps in the distance, and he saw an old man coming towards him up the stairs.
"What are you doing wandering about my castle?" asked the old man.
To whom the prince replied, "I lost my way hunting in the forest. If you will take me into your service, I should like to stay with you, and will serve you faithfully."
"Very well," said the old man. "You may enter my service. You will have to keep the stove always lit. You will have to fetch the wood for it from the forest, and you will have changed the black horse in the stables. I will pay you a florin a day, and at meal times you will always find the table in the hall spread with food and wine, and all you can eat and drink as you require."
Sounds like a good deal to me. The prince was satisfied, and he entered the old man's service, and promised to see that there was always wood on the stove, so that the fire should never die out. Now, though he did not know it, his new master was a magician, and the flame on the stove was a magic fire, and if it had gone out, the magician would have lost a great part of his power. One day the prince forgot, and let the fire burn so low that it was nearly burnt out, and just as the flame was flickering, the old man stormed into the room.
"What do you mean, letting the fire burn so low?" he growled. "I've only arrived just in the nick of time."
While the prince hastily threw a log on the stove and blew on the ashes to kindle the glow, His master gave him a severe box on the ear and warned him that if it ever happened again, it would fare badly for you. One day the prince was sitting disconsolate in the stables when, to his surprise, the black horse spoke to him. "Come to my stall," he said. "I have something to say to you. Fetch my bridle and saddle from the cupboard and put them on me. Take the bottle that is beside them. It contains an ointment which will make your hair shine like pure gold. And then put all the wood you can gather together in the fire until it is piled up quite high." So the prince did what the horse told him, and saddled and bridled the horse, and put the ointment on his hair until it shone like gold. And it made such a big fire in the stove that the flames sprang up and set fire to the roof. And in a few minutes the palace was burning like a huge bonfire. Then he hurried back to the stables, and the horse said to him, "There is one thing more you must do. In the cupboard you will find a looking-glass, a brush, and a riding whip. Bring them with you and mount my back, and ride as hard as you can, for now the house is burning merrily." The prince did as the horse bade him, and scarcely had he got into the saddle than the horse was off and away, galloping at such a pace that, in a short time, the forest and all the country belonging to the magician lay far behind them. In the meantime, the magician returned to his palace, which he found in smoldering ruins. In vain he called for his servants. At last he went to look for him in the stables, and when he discovered that the black horse had disappeared too, he at once suspected that they had gone together. So he mounted a roan horse that was in the next stall, and set out on pursuit. As the prince rode, the quick ears of the horse heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look behind you," he said, "and see if the old man is following." And the prince turned in his saddle and saw a cloud of smoke or dust in the distance. "We must hurry," said the horse. After they had galloped for some time, the horse said again, "Look behind and see if you can still see at some distance." "Oh, he is quite close," answered the prince. "Then throw the looking-glass on the ground," said the horse. So the prince threw it, and when the magician came up, the roan horse stepped on the mirror, and crash! His foot went through the glass, and he stumbled and fell, cutting his feet so badly that there was nothing the old man could do except slowly go back with him to the stables and put new shoes on his feet. And then they started once more in pursuit of the prince, for the magician set great value on the horse and was determined not to lose it. In the meantime, the prince had gone a great distance, but the quick ears of the black horse detected the sound of following feet from afar. "Dismount," said the prince. "Put your ear to the ground and tell me if you do not hear a sound." So the prince dismounted and listened. "I seem to hear the earth tremble," he said. "I think he cannot be very far off." "Mount me at once," answered the horse, "and I will gallop as fast as I can." And he set off so fast that the earth seemed to fly from under his hooves. "Look back once more," he said after a short time, "and see if he is in sight." "I see a cloud and a flame," answered the prince, "but a long way off." "We must make haste," said the horse, and shortly after he said, "Look back again. He can't be far off now." The prince turned in his saddle and exclaimed, "He is close behind us. In a minute the flame of his horse's nostrils will reach us." "Then throw the brush on the ground," said the horse. And the prince threw it. In an instant the brush was changed into a thick wood that even a bird could not have gotten through. And when the old man got up on the roan horse, suddenly came to a standstill, not able to advance, but only had to retrace his steps and fetch an axe to cut his way through the woods. But it took some time, during which the prince and the black horse got on well ahead. But once more they heard the sound of pursuing feet. "Look back," said the black horse, "and see if he's following." Yes, answered the prince. This time I hear him distinctly. Let us hurry on, said the horse. And a little later he said, Look back now, and see if he is in sight. Yes, said the prince, turning around. I see the flame. He's close behind us. Then you must throw down the whip, answered the horse. In the twinkling of an eye, the whip changed to a broad river. When the old man got up on it, he urged the roan horse into the water. But as the water mounted higher and higher, the magic flame which gave the magician all his power grew smaller and smaller, till with a fizz it went out, and the old man and the roan horse sank into the river and disappeared. The prince looked round, and they were no longer to be seen. Now, said the horse, you may dismount. There is nothing more to fear, for the magician is dead. Beside that brook you will find a willow wand. Gather it and strike the earth with it, and it will open for you, and you will see a door at your feet. When the prince had struck the earth with the wand, a door appeared, and opened into a large, vaulted stone hall. Lead me into the hall, said the horse. I will stay there, but you must go through the fields till you reach a garden, in the midst of which a king's palace. When you get there, you must ask to be taken into the king's service. Goodbye. Don't forget me. So they parted. But first the horse made the prince promise not to let anyone in the palace see his golden hair. So he bound a scarf around it like a turban, and the prince set off through the fields, till he reached a beautiful garden, and beyond the garden he saw walls and towers of a stately palace. At the golden gate he met a gardener, who asked him what he wanted. I want to take service with the king, replied the prince. Well, you may stay and work under the garden, said the man, for the prince was dressed like a poor man, and he could not tell that he was a king's son. I need someone to weed the ground and sweep the dead leaves from the paths. You shall have a 400 a day, a horse to help you with the cart the leaves away, and good food and drink. So the prince consented and set about his work. But when his food was given to him, he only ate half of it. The rest he carried to the vaulted hall beside the brook, and gave to the black horse. And this he did every day, and the horse thanked him for his faithful friendship. One evening, as they were together after his work in the garden was over, the horse said to him, Tomorrow a large company of princes and great lords are coming to your king's palace. They have been coming from far and near as wooers to the 3 princesses. They will stand in a row in the courtyard of the palace, and all 3 princesses will come out, and each will carry a diamond apple in her hand, which she will throw into the air. Whoever's feet the apple falls will be the bridegroom of that princess. You must be close in the garden in your work. The apple of the youngest princess, who will be the most beautiful of the sisters, will roll past the wooers and stop before you. Pick it up at once and put it into your pocket. The next day, when the wooers were all assembled in the courtyard of the castle, everything happened just as the horse had said. The princesses threw their apples into the air, and the diamond apple of the youngest princess rolled past the wooers, out into the garden, and stopped at the feet of the young gardener, who was busy sweeping the leaves away. In a moment he had stooped down and picked up the apple and put it in his pocket. As he stooped, the scarf from his head fell to one side a little, and the princess caught sight of his hair, and loved him from that moment. Princesses. But the king was very sad, for his youngest daughter was the one he loved best. But there was no help for it, and the next day the threefold wedding was celebrated at the palace, and after the wedding the youngest princess returned with her husband to the small hut in the garden where he lived. Some time after this, the people of a neighboring country went to war with the king, and he set out to battle, accompanied by the husbands of his 2 eldest daughters, mounted on stately steeds. But the husband of the youngest daughter had nothing but the old, broken-down horse which helped him in the garden work, and the king who was ashamed of his son-in-law, refused to give him any other. So he was determined not to be left behind. He went into the garden and mounted the sorry nag and set out. But scarcely had he ridden a few yards before the horse stumbled and fell. So he dismounted and went down to the brook where the black horse lived in his vaulted hall. The horse said to him, "Saddle and bridle me, and then we'll go to the next room, and you'll find a suit of armor and a sword. Put them on, and we will ride forth together into battle." And the prince did as he was told, and when he had mounted the horse, his armor glittered in the sun, and he looked so brave and handsome that no one would have recognized him as the gardener who swept away all the dead leaves from the path. The horse bore him away at a great pace, and when they reached the battlefield, they saw that the king was losing the day. So many of his warriors had been slain. But when the warrior on his black charger in the glittering armor appeared on the scene, hewing right and left with the sword, the enemy were dismayed and fled in all directions, leaving the king master of the field. When the king and his two son-in-laws, when they saw their deliverer, shouted, and they left the field of an army, joined in the cry, "God has come to our rescue!" And they would have surrounded him, but his black horse rose in the air and bore him out of their sight. Soon after this, part of the country rose in a rebellion against the king, and once more he and his two sons-in-law had to fare forth in battle. The son-in-law who was disguised as a gardener wanted to fight too, so he came to the king and said, "Dear father, let me ride with you into the battle and your enemies." "I don't want a blockhead like you to fight for me," answered the king. "Besides, I haven't got a horse fit for you. But see, there's a carter on the carting hay. You may take his horse." So the prince took the carter's horse, but the poor beast was old and tired, and after it had gone a few yards it too stumbled and fell. So the prince returned sadly to the garden and watched the king ride forth at the head of his army, accompanied by his two son-in-laws. When they were out of sight, the prince betook himself to the vaulted chamber by the brookside, and having taken counsel with the faithful black horse, put on the glittering suit of armor, and was borne on the back of the horse through the air, to where the battle was being fought. And once more he routed the king's enemies, hacking to right and left with his sword. And again all cried, "A god is coming to our rescue!" But when they tried to detain him, the black horse rose into the air and bore him out of their sight. When the king and his sons-in-laws returned home, they could talk of nothing but the hero who had fought for them, and all wondered who he could be. Shortly afterwards, the king of a neighboring country declared war, and once more the king and his son-in-laws went into battle. And once more the prince begged to ride with them, but the king said he had no horse to spare for him. "But," he said, "you may take the horse of the woodsman who brings the wood from the forest. It is good enough for you." So the prince took the woodsman's horse, but it was old and useless, and could not carry him beyond the castle gates. So he betook himself once more to the vaulted hall, where the black horse was preparing and waiting for him, and a suit of armor, more than the one he had worn on the previous occasions. And when he had put it on and mounted the back of the horse, he bore him straight to the battlefield, and once more he scattered the king's enemies, fighting single-handed in the ranks, and they fled in all directions. But it happened that one of the enemies struck with his sword and wounded the prince on the leg. And the king took his own pocket handkerchief with his name and crown embroidered on it, and bound it round the wounded leg. And the king would have fain compelled him to mount in a litter and be carried straight to the palace, and his two knights were to lead the black horse back to the stables. But the prince put his hand on the mane of his faithful horse and managed to pull himself up into the saddle, and the horse mounted into the air with him. Then they all shouted, "The warrior who has fought for us is a god! He must be a god!" And throughout the kingdom nothing else was spoken about, for all the people said, "Who can be the hero who has fought for us in so many battles? He cannot be a man, he must be a god!" And the king said, "If only I could see him once more, and if it turned out that he was a man and not a god, I would reward him with half my kingdom."
Now, when the prince reached his home, the gardener's hut where he had lived with his wife, he was weary and lay down on his bed and slept. And his wife noticed the handkerchief bound around his wounded leg, and she wondered what it could be. Then she looked at it more closely and saw it was the corner that was her father's name and royal crown embroidered on. So she ran straight to the palace and told her father, and he and his two son-in-laws followed her back to her house. And there lay the gardener asleep in his bed, and the scarf that he always wore bound around his head had slipped off, and his golden hair gleamed on the pillow. And they all recognized that this was the hero who had fought and won so many battles for them. There was a great rejoicing throughout the land. The king rewarded his son-in-law with half the kingdom, and he and his wife reigned happily over it. I finished that right before the ad started. I knew that story would take the rest of the time. So, let's see who is on that we might be able to raid. Is there anyone? I wonder what Virtual's doing. Let me check. Because I know Hannah has got hers listed as writing and reading, but she's also doing reruns of older stories. So she's not even there. Let's see. Virtual Digital. What is she doing? Looks like she's writing. Let's see. Creative writing session and co-working. Yeah, well. I don't want to disrupt her. She's working. I know, it's kind of a... Yay! Welcome in! Oh, did I raid myself again? Probably did. No, that's over from Micah's. Okay. You caught the end of the stream. Hey, it actually played the sound clip. Kind of quietly, but it played it. Let's see. If it's a short story, I might read one more. Let me check. Let's see. That was Magician's Horse. Oh, I can do one more. This one's only 5 pages. If you want to wait until after the ads, I'll read one for you.
Okay, I'm going to do the ads, and then I'll read one more story just because you came in. Okay? Okay. Let's get these ads out of the way then. I don't want to go to the BO back. Go back to the library. Move back over. Yep, here we go. Boy, this next story starts out like it sounds like it's going to be a joke. Not a countryman and a blacksmith. Deep, 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 deep. Come on. "30 minutes of ads. Go faster." Why am I hearing opera? Oh, that's. It just says they were traveling countryside. They do get lost in the forest. I don't see a tavern though. One more minute. Okay, Okay. Let's see. Which iconic band counts Greg Rowley, David Brown, and Outland and Navarro among its former members? Oh, Santana. That makes sense. Yay! So, our final story for the night. The Little Grey Man. A nun, a countryman, and a blacksmith were once wandering through the world together. One day they lost their way in a thick, dark forest, and were thankful when they saw in the distance a house of walls, where they hoped they might retain... I'm already screwing this up. One day they lost their way in a thick, dark forest, and were thankful when they saw, in the distance, the walls of a house where they hoped they might obtain refuge for the night. When they got close to the house, they found that it was an old deserted castle, fast falling into ruins, but with some of the rooms in it still habitable. As they were homeless, they determined to take up their abode in the castle,
and they arranged that one of them should always stay in the home and keep house, while the other two went into the world to seek their fortunes. The lot of remaining at home first fell to the nun. Where the countryman and blacksmith had gone out into the wood, she set to work, tidied up the house, and prepared all the food for the day. As her companions did not come home for their midday meal, she ate up all her own portion and put the rest in the oven to keep warm. Just as she was sitting down to sew, the door opened, and a little gray man came in, and standing before her, he said, "Oh, how cold I am!" The nun was very sorry for him, and said at once, "Sit down by the fire and warm yourself." The little man did as he was told, and soon called out, "Oh, how hungry I am!" The nun answered, "There's food in the oven. Help yourself." The little man did not need to be told twice, for he set to work and ate up everything with the greatest possible dispatch. When the nun saw this, she was very angry and scolded the dwarf because he had left nothing for her companions. The little man resented her words and flew into such a passion that he seized the nun, beat her, and threw her against one wall and then against the other. When he had nearly half killed her, he left her lying on the floor and hastily walked out of the house. In the evening, the countryman and the blacksmith returned home, and when they found, on demanding their dinner, that there was nothing left for them, they reproached the nun bitterly and refused to believe her that she had tried to tell them what had happened. The next day, the countryman asked to be left in charge of the house, and promised that, if he remained home, no one should go to bed hungry. So the other two went out into the forest, and the countryman, having prepared the food for the day, ate up his own portion and put the rest in the oven. Just as he had finished clearing away, the door opened, and the little gray man walked in, and this time he had two heads. He shook and trembled as before, and exclaimed, "Oh, how cold I am!" The countryman, who was frightened out of his wits, begged him to draw near the fire and to warm himself. Soon the dwarf looked greedily around and said, "Oh, how hungry I am!" "There's food in the oven. Eat what you want," replied the countryman. Then the little man fell in with both his heads and soon finished the last morsel. When the countryman scolded him for this proceeding, he treated him exactly as he did the nun, and left the poor fellow more dead than alive. Now, when the blacksmith came home with the nun in the evening, and found nothing for supper, he flew into a passion and swore that he would stay at home the following day, that no one should go supperless to bed. When the day dawned, the countryman and the nun set out into the woods, and the blacksmith prepared all the food for the day as the others had done. Again the grey dwarf entered the house, without knocking. This time he had 3 heads. When he complained about the cold, the blacksmith told him to sit near the fire, and when he said he was hungry, the blacksmith put some food on a plate and gave it to him. The dwarf made short work of what was provided to him, and then, looking greedily around with his 6 eyes, he demanded more. When the blacksmith refused to give him another morsel, he flew into a terrible rage and proceeded to treat him the same way he had treated his companions. But the blacksmith was a match for him, for he seized a huge hammer and struck off 2 of the dwarf's heads with it. The little man yelled with pain and rage and hastily fled from the house. The blacksmith ran after him and pursued him for a long way, but at last they came to an iron door. Through it the little creature had vanished. The door was shut behind him, and the blacksmith had to give up pursuit and return home. They found that the nun and countryman had come back in the meantime, and they were much delighted when he placed some food before them, and he showed him the 2 heads he had struck off with his hammer. The 3 companions determined there was then and there to free themselves from the power of the grey dwarf, and the next day they set to work to find him. They had to walk a long way and to search for many hours before they found the iron door through which the dwarf had disappeared. And when they found it, they had the greatest difficulty in opening it. When at last they succeeded in forcing a lock, they entered a large hall in which sat a young and lovely girl working at a table. The moment she saw the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman, she fell at her feet, thanking them with tears in her eyes for having set her free. She then told them that she was a king's daughter who had been shut up in the castle by a mighty magician. The day before, just about noon, she had suddenly felt the power over her disappear, and ever since that moment she had waited eagerly for the arrival of her deliverers. She went on to say that there was yet another princess shut up in the castle, who had also befallen under the might of the magician. They wandered through many halls and rooms, till at last they found the second princess, who was quite grateful at first, and thanked the three companions most warmly for having set her free. Then the princess told the rescuers that a great treasure lay hidden in the cellars of the castle, and that it was guarded by a fierce, terrible dog. Nothing daunted, they all went down below at once, and found the fierce animal mounting guard over a treasure the princesses had said. But one blow from the blacksmith's hammer soon made an end of the monster, and they found themselves in a vaulted chamber full of gold and silver and precious stones. Beside the treasure stood a young and handsome man, who advanced to meet them, and thanked the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman for having freed him from a magic spell he was under. He told them that he was a king's son who had been banished to this castle by a wicked magician, and that he had changed into the three-headed dwarf. When he lost two of his heads, the magic power of the princesses had been removed, and when the blacksmith had killed the horrible dog, then he too had been set free. To show his gratitude, he begged the three companions to divide the treasure between them, which they did, and there was so much of it that it took a very long time. The princesses, too, were so grateful to the rescuers that one married the blacksmith and the other the countryman. Then the prince claimed the nun as his bride, and they lived happily together until they died. The prince married a nun. That just doesn't seem quite right. But anyway. See, who was in writing and reading right now? So what did you think? See people writing, see reruns, writing. Actually, the book that I had on the side next to me, the Grey Fairy book, it's where the stories are coming from this time. There wasn't a second part to this one. This one is a German story. Seemed like it. Everyone's getting their heads bashed off. But seriously, the dwarf threw the nun against the walls.
Yeah, the Gray Fairy book was originally published in 1896, I think. Oh, 1900. And this is actually the 6th book in the series. Yeah, if you want to hear the other stories, you can check out my YouTube and just listen to me ramble all those stories off. Yeah, it's blue, red, green, yellow, pink, gray. I'm on gray now. Then there's still violet, orange, olive, brown. There's 12 books in the colored fairy books. But it's just a massive task that a company did to collect all the stories, translate them, and get them all in the books. Yeah, I have one long playlist. It's nothing but these stories. Let me pull it up real quick. That is what I have of the Andrew Lang fairy book so far. But the books that I've been writing, I've been trying to update the language and add my commentary to them and try to explain things a little bit further. Now I've only done 2 books so far. Let's see. Who all was here? We'll go ahead and read Dusk. So, read -4. One subscriber. If you follow me, you've got enough to unlock emotes, so. We're gonna read Dusk. Let me go ahead and switch to my closing window. I am going to do more Rivals of Sherlock Holmes next Thursday and back into this book next Friday. I usually stream from 9 Central to 11 Central Thursdays and Fridays. So, next time. Occasionally, if there's good enough stories, I'll keep reading longer. So. But I'll see everyone next time, and let's go say hi to Dusk. Night, everyone.